$800, that is what a surplus steel arch at a government yard outside El Paso costs a man who knows where to look. The prefab tiny home on the dealer's lot down the highway asks $45,000. Same square footage. The dealer will tell you the arch is a storage barn, and the prefab is a smart investment. He has a brochure that says exactly that. But the structure almost nobody stops to look at is the cheapest way left to put a permanent roof over your head in this country. Not a storage unit, not a campsite, a real insulated home with a locking front door that will outlast a manufactured house by 30 years on a fraction of cost. And the man with the brochure has a very specific reason for steering your father away from it. These are the Quonset builds everyone walks past, and the truth about what they actually cost. $1.5 million. That is how many Quonset huts the United States military produced between 1941 and 1945. The Navy designed them because they needed a shelter that could ship flat, bolt together fast, and go up on a Pacific island before the next supply run arrived. They were never meant to be beautiful. They were meant to be standing in the morning. After the war ended, they flooded rural America, farms in Kansas, ranches in New Mexico, back lots across the deep South. The arch showed up wherever a man needed covered storage and did not much care what the county thought his property. And that is exactly where the reputation hardened and never left. A Quonset hut was a thing your grandfather bolted behind the barn and filled with tractor parts. He never finished the end walls. His neighbors shook their heads at it for 20 years. That image has not moved in 7 decades. And it is exactly why these structures sit cheap at surplus yards and government auctions right now. The first buyer took the reputation hit. The price reflects it permanently. Here is what that reputation gets wrong. And this is the part the man at the expo is counting on you never to find out. A corrugated steel arch does not rot. It does not sag at the ridgeline after 20 years the way a stick frame shed does. The arch shape is one of the strongest load-bearing geometries in construction. The same principle that holds up stone bridges built 400 years ago. What made the Quonset look like a storage barn was never the steel. It was what people chose to put inside it, which for 70 years was nothing but equipment and indifference. The same thing that makes men drive past a surplus arch without slowing down is the exact thing that makes a finished one worth every hour of work. The stigma already happened to the first owner. You walk in after it. The median American home now runs north of $400,000. A man on a fixed retirement income looks at that number, looks at what rent costs in any mid-sized city, looks at a savings account that has to stretch another 20 years, and quietly does the arithmetic. The door is closed. What is not done is drive a county road outside town, and look at what is sitting in that surplus yard, because nobody with a commission check told him that door was still open. Here is what the math actually looks like. A genuine surplus arch runs $300 to $1,500, depending on condition and panel count. Finish it yourself. Vapor barrier insulation, interior paneling, a propane setup, a basic solar system, and a man who does his own labor lands between $5,000 and $9,000 all in. A comparable prefab tiny home delivered, and place runs $40,000 to $60,000 before the delivery fee clears. That gap is a paid-off truck, and 2 years of groceries still in your pocket. But here is the number that swings the math harder than the structure itself. And this is the piece the Tiny Home Expo never puts on a slide. A rural land placement in a county outside Nashville. Tennessee runs a man somewhere between nothing and $150 a month on an informal maintenance arrangement. A permitted rural placement in a legal tiny home zone on the California coast runs $600 to $1,200 a month before utilities. Same square footage of living space. Same corrugated steel arch if you want one. 7 times the cost. And the only thing that changed is the zip code. The cheap life under a permanent roof is real, but it lives on inland county roads and rural back acreage, not on the postcard coastlines. And where you are legally allowed to place any of these, that question has an answer that surprises almost everyone who asks it. That is coming next. The first type is the one that built the whole reputation. Drive any surplus yard from central Kansas to the outskirts of El Paso, and you'll find in the back row original military or farm salvage arches, corrugated steel ribs, dented panels, asking price somewhere between $300 and $1,500, depending on how many panels are still straight and what the end walls look like when you get close enough to check. A genuine surplus arch in decent condition is the lowest entry point to a permanent structure available in this country. The ribs bolt together in sequence. The panels attach with self-tapping screws. A man with a socket wrench set and 2 free weekends can have the shelf standing before he spends $1 on finished materials. That is the honest use case, and it is a real one. But there are 2 things a seller at a surplus yard will not bring up unless you press him on it. The first is the base flange. That is the steel lip where the arch meets the ground, where decades of moisture contact does its quiet work from the inside out. Bring a flashlight and push on it before you talk price. Soft metal at the base means the arch has been sitting on wet ground long enough to compromise the connection where it counts. The second is the end walls. Many surplus units have end walls field-built from whatever material was on hand. Not structural, not weatherproof, and not visible in a listing photograph taken from 20 feet away. There's a third thing he will not volunteer, and it has nothing to do with the steel. A surplus arch over 30 years old may require a structural engineer's letter before a standard insurer will touch it. Get that insurance quote in writing before you make any offer. A structure you cannot insure is a structure you cannot protect. And where you are allowed to place any of these is a question with a legal trap buried in it that the next part covers entirely. The next step up arrives in a crate with a bolt diagram and goes up in a weekend if you have 2 men and a socket set. Modern steel arch kit manufacturers, companies selling direct and shipping flat, price their units from $2,000 on a low end to $8,000 for a wider span and heavier gauge steel. That is still below the price of a decent used pickup. Hold that number in mind before you look at anything else. The structure is more predictable than a surplus unit. Pre-punch ribs, consistent panel spacing, and wall kits available as an upcharge. For a man who wants something more reliable than a field salvage arch, but still has no interest in contractor prices, this is the rational next step. 2 things a kit dealer will not bring up unless you ask directly. The first is galvanizing quality. It varies significantly by manufacturer, and the cheaper offshore kits corrode at the panel seams within 3 to 5 years in a wet climate. Galvanizing is like paint on a truck. It is only as good as the coat you cannot see. Ask for the gauge certificate before you wire any deposit. The second is the end wall upcharge. Budget for it from the start or plan to field build the end walls yourself from pressure-treated lumber and exterior sheathing. But here's the failure point that ends more amateur builds than any structural problem, and almost nobody talks about it until the damage is already done. Warm interior air contacts cold steel and turns into water. By morning, condensation is dripping from the ribs onto everything below. Without a vapor barrier installed before the insulation goes in, the entire interior is lost inside 18 months. 6mm poly sheeting costs $25 at any hardware store. Staple it to the ribs before you do anything else inside. A man who skips that step does not find out he made a mistake for a full year. By the time he knows, he is starting over. Here is a part almost every cheap housing video skips. And it is the part that takes down men who did everything else right. Where you place a Quonset determines whether it is a home or a liability. The structure is the easy problem. Where you are legally permitted to put it permanently is the one that ends people, and the one nobody at the Tiny Home Expo spends time on, because the honest answer sometimes sends a customer to a surplus yard instead of the dealer floor. Most rural county codes exempt structures under a certain square footage from permit requirements, provided the structure is not connected to municipal water or sewer. That threshold moves by jurisdiction. In rural Georgia, it often sits at 120 square feet. In many western counties, it runs to 200. A standard 14 by 20-foot arch footprint lands right at that line, depending on where you are standing. Know your county's number before you choose your dimensions. That call to the zoning office should happen before you buy the arch, not after it is already sitting on the ground. The informal land arrangement works in rural communities, and it is more common than most outsiders realize. A man who approaches a landowner with brush clearing, fence repair, and property checks in exchange for replacement permission on back acreage is having a conversation that rural communities have understood for generations. But verbal permission is a start, not a protection. Get a simple sign letter. A man with a handshake and nothing in writing has no recourse when the arrangement changes. There's also a residency question that I will not stand here and pretend does not exist. In most rural jurisdictions, a steel arch is classified as an accessory structure. Full-time residency in an accessory structure violates zoning in counties that choose to enforce it. Call the zoning office directly and ask whether a man can live in a steel arch structure on private land year-round. Get the answer in writing. An official who hums and hedges is telling you everything you need to know. The structure is the easy part. If this is the kind of straight talk nobody at the Tiny Home Expo will give you, hit subscribe. The next two parts are the ones the dealers really do not want you to see. The man with the brochure at the Tiny Home Expo is not your enemy, but he has a very specific reason for steering your father toward the $45,000 prefab and never once mentioning the $800 arch sitting in the back corner of the surplus yard down the road. Follow the money. A modular prefab tiny home dealer operates on margins between 15 and 25%. On a $45,000 sale, that is $6,750 to $11,000 returned to the dealer before he finishes his coffee. A surplus Quonset sold through a government auction returns nothing to anyone with a business card and a polo shirt. There is no commission on a structure nobody is actively selling. That is a $10,000 reason to call the cheap one a storage barn. But there is a second layer, and it is the part even the honest dealers will not defend. The same surplus arch gets a fresh coat of exterior paint, new listing photographs, and a new paragraph written about off-grid living. It goes up on a lifestyle real estate platform repriced at $4,500 to $8,000. A dealer acquaintance of mine calls it getting the arch dressed for company. Same steel, same ribs, same bolt holes from 1968. New photographs and a price that assumes the buyer does not know the surplus market. And now here's what the systems inside that arch actually cost, because this is where the real math lives. Solar installation companies replace panels constantly for warranty upgrades and storm damage. A panel producing 60% of rated output is worthless to a company promising customers full power. It is not worthless to the man who asks for it. 2 or 3 of those panels, mounted on a simple south-facing frame, run LED lighting, charge a phone, and power a small fan through a Tennessee summer. A used battery bank from an auto salvage yard runs $30 to $40. A charge controller ships for $35. Rainwater off the arch roof into 2 55-gallon food grade drums. Free from any processing plant replacing production equipment. Covers drinking and cooking supplemented by occasional fills. Annual purification cost in unscented bleach runs about $5. A 20-pound propane tank for cooking lasts 6 weeks and refills for $15. Annual cooking fuel runs roughly $130. Real owners who did the homework and placed their build on inland rural land report living all in for around $400 a month. Every one of those systems is working for you instead of against you. Naming the trap and leaving you scared is worse than useless. Here is what a man does before he hands over a check on any of these. First, confirm the county permit threshold before you choose your dimensions. Call the zoning office directly, not the internet. Get the number in writing and build to it. Because a man who builds 2 feet over that threshold in the wrong county is not a homeowner. He is a code violation waiting to be discovered. Second, inspect the base flanges and every bowl hole yourself before you discuss price. Bring a flashlight and a pry bar. A seller who will not give you 20 minutes alone with the structure already knows what you would find if he did. Third, install the vapor barrier before any insulation goes in. 6 mil poly, stapled to the ribs, costs $22 to $30 at any hardware store. A man who skips this step loses a whole interior in 18 months and does not understand why until it's too late to fix cheaply. Fourth, push on every end wall panel before you talk numbers. Soft end walls are what the listing photograph hides best and what the cash buyer discovers last. Fifth, get the land arrangement in writing. A handshake starts a conversation. A signed letter is what you have when the conversation changes. 6. Get an insurance quote before you make an offer. A structure you cannot insure is a structure you cannot protect. Real owners who did all of this report living all in for around $400 a month. That number moves with your land arrangement and your winters. Treat it as a starting point, not a promise. But sit it next to city rent, and you understand why the men who stop at that surplus yard almost never go back to looking at apartments. Picture that county road again. The gleaming prefab with the brochure on the door. The dented green arch in the back corner asking $800. Nothing about the land changed. The sky is the same over both of them. The only thing that ever separated those two structures was a story somebody told to protect a margin. The expensive one was never the smart buy. The arch everybody drove past was the whole answer. And the one that turns into the easiest profit on that county road is on screen right now.